Hello guys and welcome to Hidden Timelines. Now we are stepping into a chapter of history that is rarely spoken about, one that lies beneath the shimmering domes and minarets of the Ottoman Empire. We often remember this empire for its golden architecture, for its fearsome armies, for the glittering court of its sultans. But behind the silks and mosaics was a system so dark, so meticulously organised that even seasoned diplomats and chroniclers of the time struggle to put it into words. Before we continue, if this tale keeps you company tonight, leave a like and subscribe only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from and what hour has the night brought you? Imagine this: you are 7 years old, playing in the dusty lane of your Christian village in the Balkans. The smell of bread drifts from your mother's oven. Somewhere nearby your father works the fields. It is a life of ordinary hardship but also of simple joys. Suddenly, riders arrive. They are not here to collect taxes nor to enforce new laws. They are here for you. Ottoman officials carrying ledgers and registers walk from house to house with cold precision. Their eyes are not searching for gold or grain. They are searching for children. And when they knock at your family's door, you will never see your parents again. This practice was not rumour or legend. It was a state policy repeated over centuries with bureaucratic efficiency. The Ottoman Empire lasted over 600 years, stretching across 3 continents and shaping the lives of millions. It produced breathtaking mosques, libraries of philosophy, and military campaigns that changed the course of Europe and the Middle East. But it also constructed a machine of human exploitation that weaponized sexuality and childhood innocence in ways designed to terrorize entire populations into submission. What makes this history especially chilling is not simply the cruelty itself, it is the orderliness. The Ottomans were meticulous administrators. They kept records not only of taxes and harvests, but of the very children they seized. Detailed notes listed which village had given boys last year, how many households remained, and how many more sons could be expected in the next sweep. To them, these children were entries in a ledger. To the families, it was the sound of doors slamming shut on everything they loved. We must not mistake these policies as isolated excesses of a cruel ruler, or as cultural misunderstandings across centuries. They were woven into the very fabric of governance. Ottoman statesmen discussed them as calmly as European courts might discuss tariffs or treaties. The most intimate aspects of human life, marriage, childhood, sexuality, were transformed into instruments of empire. And the evidence has survived: administrative documents in Istanbul archives, the journals of European envoys and folk songs, whispered across Balkan valleys, carrying grief through generations. Eyewitness accounts describe the devastation. Mothers screaming, clawing at the soldiers, begging for mercy. Fathers standing helpless, sometimes attempting resistance and being cut down before their children's eyes. There are stories of families disfiguring their own sons, scarring their faces, or breaking their teeth, desperate to make them undesirable to the collectors. Yet the empire's machinery was relentless. Tears, blood, pleas, all were considered merely the noise of imperial administration. To grasp the terror of this moment, imagine your own name being stripped from you, your language forbidden, your faith declared a crime. Imagine that within months you no longer remember the sound of your mother's voice, because speaking her tongue is punishable by beatings. This was not only the theft of children's bodies, it was the erasure of their very selves. What makes this history even more disturbing is how early it began. Records show boys as young as 4 years old taken, though the preferred age was between 7 and 12, when their identities were still malleable. The younger the child, the easier it was to shape him into something new: a soldier, a servant, or something far worse. The Ottomans were not merely conquering lands, they were conquering human nature, reprogramming it for imperial needs. When we look at the grandeur of the Blue Mosque or the domes of Topkapi Palace, we must remember what also stood behind those walls: children who had been turned into living instruments of obedience. Some would rise to positions of incredible power, their origins hidden by new names and new faith. Others would vanish into silence, their stories extinguished. This was the opening act of a centuries-long system. It is here, in these moments of loss, the crying of a village mother, the trembling of a boy clutched by soldiers, that the darker truth of the empire begins. And it forces us to ask a question: how can human beings so capable of beauty and culture also construct systems of cruelty with such cold calculation? As we move deeper into this forgotten history, we will discover that this was not about a few corrupt officials or secret indulgences. It was about an entire empire turning sexuality, intimacy, and the innocence of children into weapons of statecraft. What you are about to hear is not easy. But it is necessary for the victims who never returned, for the families whose songs carry their memory, and for us today, who must remember how fragile civilization can be when power learns to dehumanize. The Ottomans gave a deceptively simple name to their system of child collection devshirme, literally the gathering. It sounds almost harmless, like the gathering of a harvest. But for families across the Balkans, it was not a harvest of wheat or olives. It was a harvest of sons. Every few years, imperial officers would arrive with their registers, their scrolls inked in neat Ottoman script. These were no random raids. They were carefully scheduled campaigns of human collection, and each village was expected to provide a quota of boys. An imperial scribe would read aloud how many households were here, how many male children of the right age when the last levy had been imposed. The precision was chilling, almost modern in its efficiency. Children were not just taken, they were accounted for like livestock, their names crossed off their villages, recorded in ledgers that survive in Ottoman archives to this day. The process followed rules, but rules that brought no comfort. The ideal boy was between 8 and 10, strong enough to endure training, young enough to be moulded. The officials evaluated their bodies as though they were horses at a market teeth. In some so inspected shoulders, measured eyes studied for intelligence. The finest stock one European traveller wrote chosen, as one chooses falcons. Parents had no right of refusal, resistance meant punishment, sometimes death. And yet the terror was so great that many parents did resist in desperate, heartbreaking ways. Folk stories describe mothers smearing soot across their sons' faces to make them look sickly or starving them before the officials arrived so that their ribs would show. Some fathers went further, breaking a son's arm or blinding him in one eye, preferring permanent injury to the possibility of being taken. These acts were not exaggerations invented later. Ottoman chroniclers themselves noted them with cold disapproval as obstacles to efficient recruitment. The quotas were ruthless. A village that had already given boys 5 years earlier would still be required to provide more if records showed enough households. Imagine the Sioux dread the day marked on the Southern calendar, when you knew the officials were due to return, when every mother in the village clutched her children tightly, waiting for the knock on the door. Even those who had escaped once knew they might not escape again. The devshirme was more than population control. It was a psychological weapon. Families could never feel safe. Communities lived under the permanent shadow of loss. And yet, paradoxically, the system also became a tool of propaganda. The Ottomans boasted that the levy offered poor Christian boys the chance to rise in the empire, even to become viziers or generals. A bitter irony, a system built on abduction rebranded as a ladder of opportunity. But for those left behind, the trauma lingered. The Balkans became a land of waiting mothers, of fathers, working the fields with half-empty households of siblings, remembering brothers who vanished without trace. Over generations, this sorrow transformed into culture. Ballads in Serbia, Bulgaria, Albania and Greece preserved the grief. One haunting Greek lament speaks of a mother who sewed her son's shirt with tears, knowing the Turk would take him at dawn. In Serbian epics, the Turkish gatherers became archetypal villains, shadows that haunted the edges of the village. Even centuries after the last levy was abolished, the memory refused to fade. Folk dances mimicked the separation of children from families. Proverbs carried warnings about trusting outsiders. Grandmothers told stories of ancestors lost to the levy, keeping alive the pain of generations who had watched their children led away down dusty roads. Historians today note how unusual it was for an empire to weaponize bureaucracy with such precision. Rome collected taxes, China collected grain, but the Ottomans collected children. And they did so in a way that erased personal humanity, replacing it with statistics and quotas. This is perhaps why the pain lasted so long, because every child taken was not only an individual tragedy, but part of a cold arithmetic that made suffering seem endless. And yet there is something deeply human in the way Balkan culture resisted forgetting. Music, poems and oral traditions became forms of survival. They kept alive the names of boys who would otherwise have disappeared into silence. While the empire wrote ledgers, the villagers wrote songs. And sometimes those songs are all we have to know the full weight of what was lost. If the abduction was the first wound, what followed was a deeper, more deliberate violence, the killing of the self without shedding a drop of blood. Once a boy was taken under the devshirme, the Ottoman state set about erasing his identity with the same precision it used to collect him. The moment he entered imperial custody, he ceased to be his parents' son. His Christian name was stripped away, replaced by a carefully chosen Muslim one. A Marco might become Mehmet, a Nikola now Mustafa. The new names were not only practical, they were symbolic markers of severance. They said in effect, the past is gone, you belong to the Empire now. To reinforce this, the boys were forbidden from ever uttering their birth names again. If they slipped, they were beaten. Each strike was meant to burn away memory. Language too was a battlefield. The children were scattered so that no two who shared a tongue would remain together. A boy from Bosnia might find himself surrounded only by Turkish and Arabic speakers. His mother's lullabies, once as natural as breathing, became dangerous relics. Speaking them invited punishment. Very quickly the brain learns to protect itself. The old words are swallowed, forgotten. Within months, most boys no longer remembered how to pray in their own language. They became strangers to their own childhoods. The training was isolation by design. No letters, no visits, no chance to hear news from home. The Empire knew that attachment was dangerous. A child who still remembered his village might dream of escape or rebellion. So every tie was cut, every bridge burned. The boys were told their families were infidels, their old lives sinful, their faith condemned. Sometimes they were forced to spit on a cross or trample an icon, as part of their indoctrination mocking the very symbols that once anchored them. Psychologists today would call this process identity erasure. In modern terms, it resembles what we understand as brainwashing. Studies of prisoners of war cults and authoritarian regimes show a similar pattern. Isolate the subject, strip away their language and name, replace it with new rituals, enforce obedience through reward and punishment. The human mind, especially the mind of a child, is pliable. Given time, it will bend, and when it bends far enough, it will break and reform into something unrecognizable. The Empire knew this instinctively. They didn't simply need bodies, they needed loyal instruments. A boy who still whispered his father's name in secret would always be a threat. A boy who had forgotten that name entirely could be remade into whatever the Empire required: a soldier, a servant, even a killer of his own people. That was the cruel genius of the system. Imagine the psychological cost. You are 10 years old, you try to recall your mother's face, but memory slips through your fingers like water. You are told she was an infidel unworthy of remembrance. The punishments are so severe that eventually you stop trying. One day you realize you no longer remember the shape of her hands. The child who once belonged to a family has become a blank slate, a page on which the Empire now writes. This wasn't simply conquest, it was reprogramming. An entire generation of children became living vessels of Ottoman power, their pasts erased, their futures dictated. And for those who survived the process, the tragedy was doubled. Because when they look back, there was nothing left to look back to. Once the Empire had stripped a boy of his name, his tongue and his memories, the next step was to forge him into an instrument of war. Many of the most promising were funneled into the Janissary Corps, the Ottoman Empire's elite military brotherhood feared across Europe and admired for its discipline. To be chosen was both an honour and a sentence. The Janissaries were not simply soldiers, they were a caste. They lived apart from ordinary people sworn to celibacy, forbidden to marry or raise families. Their only bond was to the Sultan himself, who was not merely their commander, but their symbolic father-master, and in a sense their go. The Janissaries were told that their bodies belonged to him alone. To obey was to live, to resist was to die. The training was relentless. Days filled with drills, weapons practice, and physical labour nights, with prayer and indoctrination. Every aspect of their lives was ordered, timed, and monitored. The boys slept together, ate together, fought together, punished each other for infractions. Their individuality, already weakened by the loss of family and name, was now dissolved into collective identity. They were no longer boys from the Balkans or Anatolia. They were Janissaries, nothing more. Historians often compare this system to the Agoj of ancient Sparta, where children were taken from their families and hardened into warriors. Both institutions sought to erase the personal and replace it with the communal. But there was a crucial difference. The Spartans allowed their warriors to return home after service to marry and raise children. The Janissaries were never meant to return. They lived and died in the Empire's service, their loyalty reinforced by isolation from all other human bonds. In this way, the Janissary Corps also resembled monastic orders in medieval Europe, sworn to chastity, poverty, obedience. Yet where monks gave themselves to God, Janissaries gave themselves to the Sultan. The difference was more than theological, it was psychological. In monasticism, celibacy was framed as spiritual liberation. In the Hürrem, the Janissaries, it was framed as absolute control. To desire a woman, to dream of a family, to long for anything beyond the Sultan's will, These were not merely sins, they were treason. But human desire cannot be erased so easily. The empire knew this, and it channeled intimacy rather than suppressing it entirely. Within the janissary ranks, homoerotic bonds were not only tolerated, but in some cases encouraged. Soldiers formed attachments to one another, older men to younger recruits, in relationships that blurred the lines between mentorship, companionship, and sexual dominance. These bonds served a dual purpose. They provided emotional release, and they tethered loyalty firmly within the course itself. Psychologically, the effects were profound. A boy who had once wept for his mother now sought comfort in the arms of another soldier. His longing for home was redirected into devotion to the brotherhood. Desire was reshaped into obedience. Even love, that most human of instincts, was co-opted into the service of empire. Contemporary European observers were horrified, describing the core as a monastery of unnatural bonds. Yet within the Ottoman world, it was seen as pragmatic. If the Sultan could not permit his warriors to marry, then their intimacy had to be redirected somewhere. Better that it remain within the barracks, controlled and regulated, than spill outward into disloyalty. The result was an army bound by more than discipline. The Janissaries were brothers, lovers, rivals, competitors. Their loyalty was welded not just through fear of punishment, but through threads of intimacy that once formed were nearly impossible to sever. This gave them a terrifying cohesion on the battlefield. They did not fight as scattered individuals, but as a living wall of men who had been stripped, reforged, and bound together in every sense. But what did this do to the boys themselves? Imagine growing up in such a system. Every natural desire, family love, individualito, was forbidden or redirected into channels approved by the state. The psychological cost must have been staggering. For some, the courts became a surrogate family, and they found a sense of belonging. For others, it was a cage where even the most private emotions were monitored and manipulated. The Janissaries rose to be the most feared military force of their time. Yet behind their discipline and a battlefield brilliance lay the silence of stolen children, the echo of prayers in forgotten tongues, and the reshaping of human hearts to serve a throne. It was an army built not just with swords and shields, but with the erasure and reconstruction of human identity itself. Among the Janissaries, intimacy was not left to chance. The Ottoman state, ever methodical, went so far as to formalize and regulate the relationships that blossomed in the barracks. This is where we encounter one of the strangest and most unsettling institutions in military history, the Civilek Oka, often translated as the Cheval Battalion. On paper, it looked like just another subdivision of the Janissary Corps. In practice, it was something else entirely, a formation designed specifically to channel, contain, and control the homoerotic bonds within the army. These relationships were not merely tolerated, they were organized. They carried their own hierarchy, their own privileges, and their own rules. The boys chosen for this battalion were usually the youngest and most physically attractive recruits. They were paired with older Janissaries, men of higher rank who would act simultaneously as mentors, guardians, and often sexual partners. The relationship was framed as an apprenticeship, a bond of loyalty and education. But beneath the noble language lay a simple truth of power and desire fused into a hierarchy of domination. Advancement could depend not only on skill with a sword, but also on submission to one's superior. It is tempting to imagine these bonds as affectionate or even consensual. Some may indeed have evolved into genuine attachments, but the reality was far more complex. A boy stripped of family and identity, dependent on his patron for survival, had little real choice. The love cultivated in the Cheval Battalion was as much about control as it was about comfort. The Empire had discovered a way to turn longing itself into a weapon of loyalty. History offers unsettling parallels. In ancient Greece, certain city-states encouraged warrior couples, believing men would fight more fiercely beside those they loved. The sacred band of Thebes, composed of some 50 male pairs, was celebrated for its valour. In Sparta, the Agauge fostered bonds between older and younger males, blending mentorship with intimacy. But there was a difference in Thebes and Sparta. These relationships often carried a dimension of pride and open recognition. Within the Ottoman Janissaries, they were bureaucratized, codified, and subordinated entirely to the Sultan's will. The result was a military culture where desire and power became indistinguishable. A recruit's body was both a battlefield and a bargaining chip. Sexual availability could secure patronage, protection, even promotions. Refusal, meanwhile, could mean ostracism, punishment, or worse. The barracks were not simply dormitories. They were arenas of hierarchy where intimacy itself was regulated by rank. European diplomats who visited Constantinople recoiled at the rumours of this battalion. They described it with words like depravity and corruption, though their disgust often mingled with fascination. To the Ottomans, however, the system was practical. By containing desire within a controlled structure, they minimised the risk of rebellion or disorder. Soldiers bonded to each other, and therefore to their commanders were less likely to desert. In this twisted calculus, sexuality was disciplined by another name. The psychological consequences are difficult to measure, but one can imagine them. For the young recruits, relationships in the Chival battalion blurred lines between protection and exploitation, between affection and coercion. For the older soldiers, intimacy became intertwined with authority, reinforcing the idea that love and power could never be separated. On the battlefield, this fusion of eros and duty produced terrifying results. Janissaries fought not only for the Sultan, but for their companions bound by ties deeper than mere camaraderie. The empire had succeeded in turning even the most private of human emotions into a weapon of war, and so behind the gleaming helmets and disciplined ranks of the Janissary corps lay a darker truth. Theirs was an army in which loyalty was not simply drilled, but desired demanded through a system where intimacy itself was conscripted into service. Not every boy taken under the devshirm was destined for the barracks. Some were chosen for an even more intimate fate. These were the boys whose features marked them as exceptionally beautiful, clear skin, bright eyes, delicate frames. Ottoman officials kept careful watch for them. To the empire they were too valuable for the battlefield. Instead they were reserved for the palace, where beauty was not just admired but weaponized. Once identified, these boys were separated from their peers and escorted to the very heart of the empire, the Sultan's court in Constantinople. Passing through the gates of Topkapi Palace was like stepping into another world. Behind its walls lay a city within a city, gardens. Fountains, marble courtyards, domed chambers, glittering with tilework and calligraphy. To outsiders it was the pinnacle of Ottoman culture, a place of art, refinement and ceremony. But for the boys brought here, it was a labyrinth of control. They were absorbed into the Endra and the Inner Palace School. Outwardly, this was an institution of prestige. The empire's finest administrators, generals and viziers were trained here. But at its core, it was also a place of profound indoctrination. The boys were stripped of their pasts, taught Persian poetry, Islamic law, Ottoman etiquette and courtly rituals. Every gesture was prescribed, every bow rehearsed. They learned not just obedience, but performance, the ability to move gracefully through the rituals that defined palace life. Hierarchy was everywhere. The palace was divided into chambers of increasing exclusivity, each one closer to the Sultan's person. Only the most trusted boys advanced from the outer service to the inner chambers. Each promotion was both a reward and a deeper entanglement. To serve the Sultan directly was the highest honour and the most dangerous. For some, this path included castration, a brutal practice designed to eliminate desire and ensure loyalty. Boys who were altered in this way became eunuchs, placed in roles that gave them proximity to the Sultan's private world. The procedure was often fatal, yet those who survived sometimes rose to extraordinary heights of power, commanding access to the Sultan's household, even shaping imperial politics. Their bodies had been mutilated, but their positions within the hierarchy could rival that of princes. The symbolism of palace life reinforced their transformation. Consider the imperial gate, the massive entrance adorned with Quranic inscriptions. For a villager's son entering under those arches, it was a symbolic rebirth, the death of one identity and the creation of another. Inside the third courtyard where the Sultan resided, silence reigned. Servants moved like shadows. Boys were expected to glide rather than walk, to bow rather than speak. The architecture itself imposed discipline, long corridors that isolated chambers that echoed every sound, courtyards that demanded ritualized movement. Every meal, every lesson, every prayer was designed to erase individuality and replace it with imperial identity. To outsiders, this looked like refinement boys dressed in silks, trained in music, schooled in calligraphy. But beneath the elegance was control. They were no longer sons, brothers, or villagers. They were pages in the Sultan's book instruments for his court, sometimes even for his desires. European visitors marvelled at the palace's grandeur without fully understanding what lay beneath. They saw boys attending to the Sultan with quiet grace, unaware that many had been torn from their families, reshaped into silent ornaments of power. Behind the delicate mosaics and fragrant gardens was a machinery of indoctrination more powerful than any sword. For those selected for the palace, survival meant obedience. Ambition meant submission. Beauty became both a blessing and a curse, opening doors to power but closing every door back to home. If the devshirm was the harvesting of children, then castration was its most grotesque refinement. For the Ottoman court, eunuchs were indispensable living tools of loyalty, guardians of secrecy, men who could never form families of their own, and whose entire existence was bound to the palace. But creating them required an act of brutality so severe that most did not survive it. The procedure itself was often outsourced. Islamic law prohibited Muslims from performing castration, so the empire relied on outsiders, Christian or Jewish physicians in Egypt, Ethiopia or Sudan, where entire workshops specialised in this grisly trade. Boys were captured, transported and operated on with primitive instruments and no anaesthesia. The mortality rate was staggering. Contemporary sources estimate that 9 out of 10 children died on the table or in the days after succumbing to blood loss, shock or infection. The empire accepted this loss as part of its calculation. If 100 eunuchs were needed, 1,000 boys could be sacrificed. The mathematics of cruelty was cold and precise. Those who survived were divided into 2 classes. African boys brought through Red Sea or Saharan slave routes endured total removal of genitalia. They became known as the Kara Az Black Eunuchs. These men, because of their condition, were considered safe around the Sultan's harem women. Ironically, their mutilation gave them access to the most private spaces of the empire. Some rose to extraordinary power, becoming chief eunuchs who managed the harem, controlled the Sultan's correspondence and influenced appointments at the highest levels. In a world where proximity to the Sultan meant everything, black eunuchs could wield authority greater than that of viziers. By contrast, boys taken from the Balkans or Anatolia typically endured partial castration, the removal of testicles but not the penis. They were called Ake-Az, white eunuchs. These men were not assigned to the harem, but to administrative and ceremonial roles, serving as gatekeepers, scribes or stewards. Though less politically dominant than their African counterparts, they remained indispensable in maintaining palace discipline. The paradox is haunting. Castration was both the ultimate act of dehumanization and perversely a pathway to power. A eunuch could rise from being a mutilated slave to a palace official who whispered into the Sultan's ear. Yet his humanity was forever compromised, his body mutilated, his lineage extinguished. He was powerful, but he was alone. The Ottomans were not unique in this reliance on eunuchs. They were inheritors of a much older tradition. The Byzantine Empire had employed eunuchs as trusted court officials prized for their loyalty. In the Abbasid Caliphate, eunuchs guarded harems and served as advisors in Baghdad's palaces. In China, the Ming dynasty relied on armies of eunuchs, some commanding vast bureaucracies. But the Ottomans perfected the practice with bureaucratic efficiency and scale, embedding it into the very structure of governance. The underlying logic was always the same: mutilation as insurance. A eunuch could never father children, never build a dynasty of his own, never threaten the throne with heirs. His ambitions were shackled to the empire alone. His survival depended entirely on favour, and favour could vanish overnight. In this way, the empire turned biological violence into political security. Imagine the psychological burden carried by these men. They were stripped of the possibility of ordinary intimacy, of fatherhood, of legacy. They existed in a twilight world, neither fully male nor fully outside society. Some wielded immense influence, but their power was borrowed, fragile, contingent on the Sultan's will. Others lived lives of quiet despair, shadows in the corridors of power, their voices unheard except in the service of another's command. Behind the shimmering walls of Topkapi, the empire's greatness was written in marble and tile. But hidden beneath that beauty was another truth: that the empire trusted no one unless their body had first been broken. For the rare few who survived castration, life inside the Ottoman court was a paradox. These men became essential to the machinery of empire, trusted with secrets, guardians of women and children, administrators of wealth and correspondence. Yet for all their influence, they were marked by a wound that never healed. Their bodies had been mutilated, their futures stolen. They were alive, but in many ways they lived as the dead. The palace corridors were full of their presence. Black eunuchs guarded the harem, standing at the gilded doors like sentinels of silence. White eunuchs manned the outer chambers, announcing audiences, keeping order in the ceremonial halls. They were everywhere, and yet they were invisible. No family name, no heirs, no kinship to claim them. They existed solely as instruments of the Sultan's will. Some rose to positions of immense authority. The Kızlar Asa, the chief black eunuch, became one of the most powerful figures in the empire, controlling access to the Sultan's harem and correspondence. In some reigns he influenced succession itself, deciding which concubine's son would be groomed as heir. European ambassadors whispered with dread about these men, noting how a figure mutilated in childhood could hold more sway over imperial policy than viziers and generals. But their power was fragile. It lived and died with the Sultan's favour. One word, one suspicion, and even the mightiest eunuch could be exiled or strangled, disappearing from the record as though he had never lived. Beneath the silks and jewels of their office lay a private torment. Accounts from contemporaries, European visitors, Ottoman chroniclers, and even later memoirs hint at the psychological scars. Eunuchs often expressed envy of ordinary men. Some wept privately when they saw fathers with sons. Others sank into bitterness, wielding their power cruelly against those who reminded them of what they had lost. There are stories of eunuchs who lavished attention on adopted boys, trying to fill the void of fatherhood, only to be reminded that nothing could replace what had been taken. Their identities were ambiguous, hovering between worlds. They were not fully men in the eyes of society yet. They were not free from male responsibility. They could not marry yet. They were not women. They lived at the heart of the palace, yet they were outsiders to every lineage. Some contemporaries describe them as shadows, others as third beings. Modern scholars call this the liminal identity, neither inside nor outside, perpetually in between. This in-betweenness granted them unusual perspective. A eunuch could move in spaces forbidden to ordinary men standing in women's quarters, handling delicate negotiations, but it also condemned him to loneliness. He belonged nowhere, fully. He could shape dynasties, but never create one. He could whisper in the Sultan's ear, but never hear the laughter of his own child. The title living dead is no exaggeration. For many eunuchs, survival meant not just enduring mutilation, but carrying the slow death of intimacy, fatherhood, and belonging. They were alive in body, influential in politics, but dead to the fundamental bonds of humanity. And so while history records their power, it also whispers of their silence, the footsteps echoing in marble halls, the unread letters, the empty chambers where no children played. These men served as a reminder that the empire valued loyalty only when it had first destroyed the possibility of love. Among the most disturbing spectacles in Ottoman society was the tradition of the Kösem dancers, young boys, often adolescents, dressed in women's clothing and trained to perform in taverns, banquets, and palace gatherings. The word Kösem itself comes from Persian meaning small or young, a cruelly fitting label for children forced into roles that blurred gender and erased dignity. The boys were chosen for their beauty and grace. Their hair was grown long and braided, their eyes darkened with kohl, their bodies dressed in silks and veils meant to mimic the allure of women. They were trained to sway their hips, to move with feminine gestures, to dance in ways that inflamed rather than entertained. To the Ottoman elite, these performances were more than amusement. They were an indulgence of decadence, a display of dominance over the bodies that had no agency. But the performances rarely ended with applause. Eyewitnesses described scenes of chaos. Drunken men shouting, throwing coins, fighting each other for the chance to seize the dancers. Glasses smashed, daggers drawn, blood spilled on marble floors. The boys themselves had no protection. Once the music ended, they were vulnerable to whatever the crowd demanded. Assaults were common. Deaths were not unheard of. For the dancers, survival meant submission. It is important here to distinguish between art and abuse. Cross-dressing performers existed in many cultures. In Elizabethan England, boys played female roles on stage, but their performances were theatrical and the audience knew them as actors. In Japan, the onagata of kabuki theatre became masters of stylized femininity, celebrated as artists. In both cases, performance was framed as an art form, and while exploitation may have existed, the cultural purpose was aesthetic. The Kösem tradition was different. It was not theatre but spectacle, not art but degradation. The purpose was not to celebrate beauty, but to provoke desire, and to leave the boys defenceless before it. Contemporary accounts describe men hurling coins at the dancers like hunters throwing bait at, then descending on them in a frenzy. Violence was not an accident of the tradition, it was woven into its fabric. By the 17th century, the Kösem dancers had become notorious across the empire. European travellers wrote about them with fascination and horror, unable to reconcile the elegance of Ottoman court culture with the brutality of these entertainments. Some even suggested that the Sultan's court tolerated the practice precisely because it revealed the power of the elite to blur gender, to degrade children, to treat human beings as toys for pleasure. Eventually, the violence became so extreme that the practice was suppressed. Sultan Mahmud II in the early 19th century ordered the dissolution of the Kösem troops after repeated riots and scandals. But by then generations of boys had already endured the humiliation. Their dances had lit palaces with laughter, their suffering had fueled nights of revelry, and their broken bodies had been discarded when the music stopped. The story of the Kösem dancers reveals the darkest side of decadence. It shows how entertainment stripped of humanity becomes cruelty, how art when twisted by power becomes exploitation. The Ottoman elite cloaked themselves in silken ceremony, but in the candlelit chambers where the boys danced, the empire revealed its true face, one of hunger without restraint, desire without compassion, and power without mercy. If the Kösem dancers were at least visible performing before crowds leaving behind scandalized descriptions in European journals, another category of boys lived in complete silence. They were known as Tavşan Oğlanlar, literally bunny boys. The name sounds almost playful, but it concealed one of the darkest secrets of the Ottoman palace system. These were not official pages of the Enderun, nor janissaries, nor even public entertainers. They had no place in the bureaucratic charts of palace service. They were chosen purely for their beauty and youth, brought into the inner sanctums of the court for the gratification of high-ranking officials. Unlike the dancers, they did not perform for an audience. They existed for private consumption, hidden away from the eyes of society and shielded from the scrutiny of law. In a sense, they were ghosts. They had no recognised status, no protections, no career path. A janissary might at least rise to become an officer. A page might hope to become a vizier. A eunuch might wield power as guardian of the harem. But the Tavşan Oğlanlar had nothing. Their lives began in silence and ended in silence. Many vanished from the record altogether, their names erased the moment they crossed the palace threshold. The empire kept meticulous records of almost everything: taxes, births, harvests, even the number of spoons in a palace kitchen. But about these boys the archives are nearly mute. There are only hints, a stray reference in a traveller's account, a cryptic note in a bureaucrat's correspondence. The silence itself is telling. What is absent from the record is sometimes more revealing than what is present. The empire, so proud of its administration, deliberately concealed this system, ensuring that its victims would never even exist on paper. The families of these boys also lived in silence. Unlike those taken for the Janissary levy, whose fate, however painful, was at least known, the families of Tavşan Oğlanlar received no explanation, no rumour of survival. Their sons were swallowed whole by the palace. In folk memory, such disappearances became indistinguishable from death. Mothers told stories of children who were eaten by the palace, a phrase as much metaphor as reality. This erasure was total. To be a Tavşan Oğlan was to be erased twice, first from your family and community, and then from history itself. No monument, no chronicle, no ballad remembered you. You were alive yet invisible. The metaphor of invisibility is powerful here. These boys were like shadows, present, touched, used, but never acknowledged. Their erasure reminds us that history is not only what is written down, but also what is deliberately left out. The Ottoman Empire recorded its victories and taxes with pride, but it buried the existence of the Tavşan Oğlanlar under layers of silence. What little we know comes from whispers. European envoys whose access to the palace was limited sometimes heard rumours of the bunny boys, but rarely saw them. A handful of Ottoman poets alluded obliquely to beautiful youths hidden away, their verses charged with melancholy and desire. Beyond that we are left with absence, a void where thousands of human lives should be. And perhaps that is the greatest cruelty. To be remembered even in grief is to exist. To be forgotten is to vanish twice. The Tavşan Oğlanlar were not only abused in their lifetimes, they were denied even the dignity of memory. If taking the body was violent, taking the soul was far worse. Once the boys were absorbed into Ottoman service, the empire demanded not only their labour, but their faith. Conversion to Islam was compulsory, and it was enforced with rituals that left permanent scars. Christian children were forced to spit on crosses, to trample icons of saints, sometimes even to burn the Bibles and prayer books they had once heard read aloud at home. They were told their parents were infidels, their families damned. At first, many resisted, crying, trembling, clinging to the fragments of the faith that had been their only comfort. But resistance brought pain, beating, starvation, isolation. For a child, the fear was overwhelming. In time, most gave in. They whispered the new prayers, bowed in the new rituals, and slowly their memories of the old ones faded. What made this system uniquely cruel was how it turned victims into perpetrators. Boys who had once wept as they were taken eventually grew into men whose duty was to return to their own homelands and select the next generation. Imagine it, a child taken from a Serbian or Bulgarian village raised in the palace until he forgot his name, and then sent back as an Ottoman officer to point at the strongest, handsomest boys of his former neighbours. Trauma was recycled, institutionalised, made self-perpetuating. This cycle is what modern psychologists call intergenerational trauma. Pain does not simply vanish when the moment ends, it embeds itself, carried in memory, in silence and cultural patterns. Entire communities in the Balkans lived under the shadow of the devshirme. Parents mutilated their children to save them. Siblings grew up haunted by the absence of brothers who never returned. And those same children, now grown into Ottoman officials, inflicted the same wound on others. Trauma replicated itself like a disease. The scars of this system lingered in culture. Balkan resistance songs, still sung in remote mountain villages, speak of mothers weeping as sons are led away of young boys begging to remain at home, of villagers mourning together under the shadow of the levee. These laments were not just songs, they were vessels of memory carrying grief across centuries. Uprisings too were fueled in part by this system. The memory of stolen sons helped ignite rebellions in Bosnia, Serbia, Greece and Bulgaria. When peasant armies rose against Ottoman garrisons, their chants often carried echoes of the devshirme, framing the fight not just as a political struggle, but as a battle for the survival of their children. Even centuries after the levy ended, the hatred it bred did not fade. Folk tales from the 19th century still cast the Turkish gatherer as a figure of terror, the embodiment of oppression itself. The devshirme was not only about military recruitment, it was cultural genocide. By severing children from their families, erasing their language and forcing them to renounce their faith, the empire sought to hollow out entire peoples from within. It was not enough to conquer lands. The Ottomans sought to conquer memory, to erase identity, until nothing was left but obedience. And yet despite the empire's efforts, memory survived in song, in whispered stories, in resistance. The voices of mothers and the cries of children did not vanish. They became the heartbeat of nations struggling to endure. Until now we have followed the fate of boys taken broken and remade into soldiers, eunuchs and shadows of themselves. But the Ottoman system of exploitation did not end with sons. It extended just as ruthlessly to daughters, wives and sisters. For women, the empire built an entire economy around their bodies. At its heart stood Constantinople, where the slave markets operated with a scale and sophistication that shocked even seasoned travellers. To walk into one of these markets was to enter a theatre of commodification. Women stood in rows, categorised, and priced according to a complex hierarchy. African women were priced differently than European women. Virgins fetched more than widows or mothers. Young girls were prized above mature women. Those trained as odalisques, concubines, schooled in seduction, song and massage commanded the highest sums. The empire reduced human beings to line items as coldly calculated as spices or silk. Surviving records describe this arithmetic of flesh. An African girl intended for household labour might be valued at 1/500 to 500 kurush, but if she was destined for sexual use, her price could double or triple. A Greek or Circassian woman prized for her lighter skin and features might fetch a fortune equivalent to the wealth of a small estate. At the very top of the scale were odalisques selected for imperial harems, whose prices reached staggering heights, tens of thousands of kurush. Their beauty was treated as currency, their fertility as investment. This system was not uniquely Ottoman. It echoed and expanded upon traditions from other civilizations. Venetian markets had long trafficked in Slavic women, a practice so widespread that the very word slave comes from slav. Arab markets in Cairo and Damascus dealt in African concubines for centuries before the Ottomans rose to power. The difference was scale and systematization. Where earlier markets had been local or regional, the Ottomans made it imperial policy, integrating the trade into their taxation system, their military campaigns and even their diplomatic arrangements. Their capture of women became an explicit part of war strategy. Ottoman commanders calculated how many captives could be taken from each campaign. Villages were raised not just for land, but for human stock. These women were marched to Constantinople, displayed in markets and priced according to the empire's merciless criteria. What emerges is an unsettling truth. Sexual slavery was not a side effect of conquest, it was a pillar of the imperial economy. Revenues from slave sales filled treasury coffers, funded palace construction, and maintained the bureaucratic machine. For some officials, trafficking women was more lucrative than governing provinces. The empire profited not only from its armies and its trade routes, but from the systematic reduction of women into merchandise. Behind each transaction lay a human tragedy, a young girl torn from her family, stripped of her name and sold into a life where her body was not her own. Mothers separated from daughters, sisters divided never to see each other again. And unlike male recruits who might after decades achieve positions of power, enslaved women had almost no chance of reclaiming autonomy. Their fates depended entirely on the desires of their purchasers. The slave markets of Constantinople operated for centuries. They became so normalized that visitors described them as casually as one might describe a bazaar of spices or carpets. But beneath the bustle of bargaining was a river of suffering. Women were inspected, handled, and humiliated before being sold, their worth determined by criteria that erased their humanity. It is here in the cold arithmetic of the slave market that we see most clearly how the empire turned exploitation into infrastructure. The buying and selling of women was not hidden. It was public, regulated, and profitable, and the wealth it generated helped sustain the grandeur of the palaces, the armies of the janissaries, and the ceremonies that dazzled foreign envoys. If the slave markets were the entry point, the harem was the final destination for many women, and yet what most people imagine when they hear the word harem bears little resemblance to reality. Popular fantasy, fed by Orientalist painters and later by Hollywood, depicts it as a paradise of cushions, jewels, and idle pleasure where women lounged in luxury waiting for the Sultan's affection. The truth was far darker. The harem was not a sanctuary of indulgence. It was a fortress of fear, rivalry, and coercion. At its core, the harem was a prison disguised in silk. Women lived under constant surveillance, guarded by eunuchs and cut off from the outside world. They could not leave without permission. Letters to their families were forbidden. Even within the harem, they were never free. Every gesture, every smile, every whisper was part of a deadly competition. The structure itself encouraged warfare among women. Hundreds lived in cramped quarters, all vying for recognition. To attract the Sultan's attention was to secure protection and perhaps even influence. To be ignored meant obscurity, neglect, or worse. Ambition turned natural solidarity into rivalry. Women spied on one another, reported infractions, sabotaged rivals' chances. Betrayal was survival, punishments were severe. A concubine who failed to please could be beaten, starved, or expelled. Expulsion in many cases was a death sentence. An aging or disfavoured woman might be sold to a brothel or abandoned in the streets of Constantinople. Rumours even speak of executions, women drowned in the Bosphorus, their bodies weighted and sunk beneath the waves. Whether or not all such stories are true, they capture the atmosphere of terror that surrounded life in the harem. And yet within this labyrinth of fear, some women did manage to rise to extraordinary heights. The most famous example is Hürrem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana. Originally a Ukrainian girl, captured in a raid, she entered the harem as a slave, but through intelligence and determination she won the favour of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. She bore him children, secured her own marriage to him, a rare honour, and eventually became one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history. She influenced imperial policy, corresponded with foreign rulers, and built charitable foundations that survive to this day. Other concubines followed similar paths. Once a concubine's son became sultan, she herself assumed the title of Valide Sultan, or Queen Mother. This position gave her authority over the harem, and often over imperial politics as well. In the 17th century, during a period historians call the Sultanate of Women, mothers of sultans, effectively ruled the empire, making decisions about wars, appointments, and finances. Names like Kösem Sultan and Turhan Sultan stand out as women who turned captivity into dominion. But these cases were exceptional, a tiny fraction who survived and thrived. For every Hürrem or Kösem, thousands of nameless women languished in silence, their youth spent competing for favour, their bodies consumed by the system, their voices lost to history. The rise of a few does not erase the suffering of the many. The fragile line between survival and death in the harem was always present. A smile at the wrong moment, a whisper overheard in illness at a critical time. Any of these could mean the difference between advancement and ruin. The harem was less a place of pleasure than a crucible where women lived in constant tension, their fates hanging on forces they could neither predict nor control. The myth of the harem as a paradise lingers because it is comforting, even titillating. But the reality was that it was an institution of exploitation and fear gilded with luxury to mask its cruelty. For the women inside, it was not a dream, but a gamble, a wager where the stakes were nothing less than life and death. If the harem was a theatre of rivalry, its cruelest act often played out in the fate of the children born within its walls. Not every union between sultan and concubine or between master and slave resulted in heirs destined for palaces. Many children, especially those born of African mothers, were erased before they ever had the chance to live. Infanticide was an unspoken but well-documented reality. Contemporary observers noted with unease the curious absence of mixed-race children in the streets of Constantinople. How could it be, they wondered, that a city filled with African women enslaved as concubines or servants produced so few visible descendants? The answer was brutal. Many of these children were killed at birth. Their existence threatened the carefully crafted racial and social hierarchies of the empire. To the Ottoman elite, lineage was everything. A concubine who bore a son by the Sultan might become Valid Sultan one day, but a child born to a lesser mother, especially one with African heritage, was seen as an inconvenience, a disruption to the order of succession and the empire's racial ideals. These infants were often smothered, drowned, or quietly removed from the palace, their deaths unrecorded, their mothers left in silence. For those women, the grief was unspeakable. They could not mourn openly, for to do so was to challenge the very system that enslaved them. This was not simply cruelty for its own sake, it was cruelty in service of control. By erasing the children who did not fit the desired mould, the empire maintained an image of order and purity. The harem, for all its chaos, was engineered to produce heirs of acceptable lineage and appearance. Any life that fell outside those boundaries was expendable. European travellers were struck by this absence. They wrote of bustling markets where thousands of African women lived in servitude, yet noted with astonishment that the population of Constantinople showed little evidence of their children. To them it was an eerie silence, a population erased before it could exist. One Venetian diplomat remarked bitterly, "The Turk does not allow what he himself has begotten to live should it bear the mark of the wrong mother." The cruelty of this system lay not only in death, but in the erasure of possibility. These children represented futures that could never unfold, families that could never exist, voices that could never be heard. Their absence was as deliberate as the grandeur of the empire's architecture, a hidden policy designed to preserve hierarchy at the cost of human lives. And so the harem, already a place of fear and competition, became a place of quiet mourning. Women who survived long enough to age out of favour carried with them not only the memory of rivalry, but also the unhealed wounds of lost children. They lived with the knowledge that their offspring had been sacrificed on the altar of imperial control. This is the hidden legacy of the harem. Not the silks and perfumes of fantasy, but the silence of infants never allowed to cry, the empty spaces in history where lives should have been. It is a reminder that empires are often built not only on the suffering of the living, but also on the deliberate erasure of those never permitted to live at all. In the Ottoman world, cruelty was not confined to hidden chambers or whispered rituals of the harem. It could be paraded, openly transformed into spectacle. Executions in particular were stages upon which power was displayed, and sometimes that power took the form of sexual humiliation. Those convicted of sexual crimes, real or fabricated, were not merely put to death. They were degraded. First, their bodies turned into symbols of dishonour. Contemporary accounts describe men stripped naked before jeering crowds, their genitals mutilated before the final blow. Others were forced into mockeries of the very acts they had been accused of, staged in public squares, while bystanders shouted, laughed, and placed wagers on how long they would survive. The punishment was not only meant to kill, but to annihilate the victim's humanity, to make his suffering an entertainment before his death. And the crowds came. Ordinary citizens gathered to watch, to point to howl their approval or disgust. Children stood on tiptoe to glimpse the spectacle. In those moments, the executioner's platform was not merely a site of justice, but of theatre where cruelty became communal experience. People placed bets on whether a victim would faint or scream, on how many blows it would take to end him. The human body was no longer sacred. It was a canvas on which the empire painted its dominance. History offers unsettling parallels. The Roman gladiatorial games turned death into entertainment, with crowds cheering as men were torn apart by beasts. In medieval Europe, public tortures drew massive audiences, from hangings to the breaking wheel. Yet there is something uniquely chilling in the Ottoman version, the deliberate fusion of sexual humiliation with execution. To strip, expose and mutilate a body was to deny not only life but dignity, to destroy the very possibility of memory and honour. This was dehumanization as state theatre. The empire signalled to its people, not only can we kill you, we can unmake you, reducing your body to an object of ridicule. It was power flexed not on the battlefield, but in the marketplace square where every man, woman and child could witness what awaited those who defied the order. The psychological impact on society was immense. Public cruelty normalised private cruelty. When children grew up laughing at the humiliation of others, they learned that suffering was natural, that degradation was deserved. The empire thus ensured that violence was not only feared but accepted, woven into the cultural fabric as spectacle, as tradition, as sport. And so beneath the grandeur of the Sultan's banners, the empire staged its darkest dramas, lives destroyed not in seasons, but in applause. What begins as violence can over time become normality. In the Ottoman Empire, generations grew up under a system where trafficking, castration and sexual exploitation were not hidden scandals, but visible facts of daily life. For a child in Constantinople to see chained captives march through the markets was no more surprising than seeing a cart of grain. For a boy in a Balkan village to hear whispers of the devshirme was as ordinary as hearing about the harvest. Violence was not the exception, it was the order. Religion gave this order its justification. Imams preached that enslaving non-Muslims was not only permissible, but virtuous, a reward granted to the faithful. The Quranic injunctions about slavery were interpreted in ways that sanctified the empire's policies and sermons across Anatolia, and the Balkans reinforced the message those taken were infidels, their bodies rightful spoils of conquest. To resist was framed not as rebellion against cruelty, but as rebellion against God. The legal codes made the hierarchy explicit. Ottoman Sharia-based law held that raping a free Muslim woman was punishable by death. But raping a slave woman, Christian, African, Circassian, was not a capital crime. It was treated as property damage. The fine was calculated in coin as though the woman were livestock injured by misuse. Such codes did more than regulate, they taught. They taught men that humanity could be divided, that some women's bodies were sacred, while others were disposable. Even education played its part. In the madrasas, where young boys memorized scripture and law, they absorbed lessons about hierarchy and obedience. Texts framed the capture of unbelievers as divinely sanctioned. Stories of conquests emphasized the taking of captives as evidence of God's favor. By the time these boys became adults, they did not see the slave market as cruelty. They saw it as destiny fulfilled. And so the cycle perpetuated itself. A child who watched slaves paraded in the streets would grow into a man who purchased one. A boy indoctrinated to believe that unbelievers were inferior would grow into a soldier who enforced the devshirme. Violence was normalized, woven into the architecture of society until few questioned it. This normalization was perhaps the empire's greatest success and its greatest crime. It ensured obedience not through constant terror but through acceptance. Families mutilated their children to protect them, yet accepted that the levy itself was inevitable. Women mourned their stolen daughters, yet sang lullabies that spoke of loss as though it were the natural rhythm of life. To live under such conditions was to carry sorrow so long that it became indistinguishable from reality. The genius of the system lay in its ability to make exploitation appear eternal. By fusing religion, law and education with daily practice, the Ottomans transformed acts of cruelty into pillars of society. And once cruelty becomes ordinary, it is harder to resist. Entire generations grew up never imagining a world without it. If cruelty was normalized in Ottoman society, it was because cruelty paid. The trafficking of boys and women was not a marginal enterprise. It was a cornerstone of imperial finance. The empire built its grandeur not only on taxes and trade routes, but on the commodification of human lives woven directly into its economic bloodstream. Slave markets across Constantinople, Cairo and Aleppo pulsed like arteries of empire. They supplied the palaces with concubines, the harems with odalisques, the army with eunuchs and pages. Revenues from these markets poured into the treasury. Officials collected fees on every sale, imposed levies on slave caravans, and even taxed households that owned large numbers of captives. A woman's body was not just a possession, it was a source of state revenue. Military campaigns were planned with this economy in mind. Ottoman commanders calculated not just territory to be gained, but people to be captured. Villages in the Balkans, the Caucasus and North Africa were stripped of their youth, marched in chains across mountain passes and funneled into markets. The capture of women and children was not incidental plunder, it was strategy. A campaign that yielded few captives was considered a failure no matter how many fortresses were taken. The infrastructure of this trade was vast. Shipping routes carried captives across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Caravans marched them across deserts into Anatolia. Agreements with vassal states required the regular delivery of human tribute. Venetian merchants, despite their Christian piety, quietly brokered deals profiting by transporting slaves into Ottoman ports. The empire's bureaucrats tracked all of it their ledgers as detailed for human beings as for grain or coin. Evidence of this efficiency survives in chilling detail. Registers list children by age, origin and price. Inventories of harems itemize women as though they were furniture, one Circassian, 17 years old trained in music, one Georgian 14 untrained. The same handwriting that recorded taxes and military expenditures calmly noted the trade in human beings. For the administrators there was no moral distinction. It was all economy. In this light, sexual exploitation was not a private vice, but a political economy. The Sultan's palaces, the janissary barracks and the harems were not just spaces of desire, they were engines of finance. By turning human intimacy into commodity, the empire funded its expansion, its wars, its dazzling architecture. Behind every marble dome and gilded courtyard stood the invisible suffering of captives whose bodies had been monetized for imperial glory. This system also created perverse incentives. Officials enriched themselves by manipulating the trade, favouring campaigns likely to yield captives lobbying for policies that expanded markets. Wealthy families purchased enslaved women not only for pleasure, but as investments. A concubine who bore children could increase a household's prestige, and her offspring could even climb into positions of power. Thus human trafficking became not just tolerated, but aspirational a pathway to wealth and influence. The Ottoman Empire's reliance on this trade reveals a sobering truth. Sexual exploitation was not an aberration, it was infrastructure. It funded wars, sustained palaces, and shaped society at every level. And because it paid so well, it endured for centuries, defended by soldiers, justified by clerics, and recorded by bureaucrats with chilling precision. As the Ottoman Empire stumbled into its final centuries, its armies weakened, its provinces peeled away, and European powers closed in, one might imagine that the darker systems of its past dissolved with its decline. But exploitation does not vanish simply because an empire falls. It adapts, mutates, and survives in quieter forms. By the 19th century, the Devshirme levy had long ended, yet the echoes of stolen children lingered in Balkan songs and family histories. Slave markets in Constantinople officially closed under European pressure, but private trafficking continued in shadow. Eunuchs still patrolled the palace gates. Women still vied for survival within harems even as the empire faltered. The machinery slowed, but it did not stop until the very end. In 1922, the last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, was dethroned and sent into exile. That date is not ancient history. It is within living memory. There are families today whose grandparents were alive when the Sultan's banners were lowered for the last time. The empire that institutionalized exploitation for centuries is closer to us than we think, and its scars remain. In the Balkans, folk laments about the blood tax still echo in rural villages, reminders of generations lost to imperial levies. In the Middle East, memories of harems and concubinage linger in stories whispered by great-grandparents. In North Africa, the legacy of slave routes remains etched into communities shaped by centuries of forced migration. These are not distant wounds. They are intergenerational scars carried into the present. Modern historians have begun to trace these shadows. Genetic studies show traces of Ottoman practices woven into populations across 3 continents. Archival records once ignored are now being opened, revealing ledger after ledger that reduce human beings to numbers, prices and categories. Each record is a voice struggling to be heard, each line a reminder of a life erased by bureaucracy. But perhaps the greatest legacy is cultural, the normalization of dehumanization. When generations are taught that human beings can be divided into sacred and disposable, into owners and property, into conquerors and captives, that lesson does not disappear with a single revolution. It seeps into laws, into attitudes, into silences. The Ottomans are gone, but the structures of thought they left behind still influence societies struggling with inequality and exploitation today. This is why remembering matters. The story of the Ottoman Empire's sexual exploitation is not simply about condemning a past civilization. It is about recognizing how easily humanity can be stripped away, how bureaucracy can turn suffering into statistics, how religion and law can be twisted into justifications for cruelty. history does not vanish because it is uncomfortable. It lingers, waiting to be uncovered, waiting for voices willing to speak the names of those silenced. The mothers who wept as their sons were taken, the eunuchs who lived as shadows in marble halls, the concubines who gambled their lives in the harem, the children who never had the chance to breathe. They all deserve remembrance. And for us, their memory carries a warning. Civilization is fragile. The moment we allow dehumanization to become normal, the moment we accept cruelty as inevitable, we open the door for history to repeat itself. The Ottoman Empire is gone, but its echoes remain in the songs of the Balkans, in the silences of families who never saw their children again, in the archives where ledgers of suffering sit bound in dust. To read them is to hear the faint heartbeat of millions whose stories were nearly erased. Our task now is not only to understand, but to remember, because memory is the only monument the silenced will ever have. Life lessons from the shadows of empire. History, when stripped to its rawest form, is never just about dates and rulers. It is about people, their bodies, their dignity, their silence. The story of the Ottoman Empire's exploitation teaches us lessons that reach beyond time, across cultures and into our present lives. The first lesson is about the fragility of humanity under power. The Ottomans show us how quickly systems can turn intimate human bonds into tools of control. A mother's love, a child's innocence, a woman's beauty, each became currency. When governments decide that people can be reduced to property, the deepest human connections can be shattered in the name of efficiency. It reminds us that compassion is not guaranteed by civilization. It must be defended vigilantly every day. The second lesson lies in the danger of normalization. The empire's genius was not simply its cruelty, but its ability to make cruelty appear natural. Sermons framed slavery as divine duty. Legal codes made exploitation rational. Education taught obedience as truth. Once a generation grows up seeing injustice as ordinary, it becomes self-perpetuating. Today we must ask ourselves, what practices in our own societies have we grown used to simply because they are common? History warns us to question what seems normal if it degrades human dignity. The third lesson is about the endurance of trauma. The mothers who lost sons, the women who mourned children, never allowed to live the eunuchs who walked palace halls as shadows. Their grief did not vanish. It seeped into songs, into silences, into cultures that still carry their memory centuries later. Trauma can last longer than empires. We see it in communities still marked by conquest, displacement, and systemic exploitation. Recognizing these wounds is part of healing. Ignoring them only deepens the scar. The fourth lesson is one of resistance through memory. Even when the empire tried to erase identities, villages remembered. They sang laments, told stories, carved warnings. Into folklore, memory became rebellion. It teaches us that remembrance itself is a form of survival. When official records bury suffering, in settlements, people can resist by keeping stories alive through art, music, ritual, and testimony. In our own world, remembering injustices past and present is a moral duty. Finally, there is the lesson of vigilance against dehumanization. The Ottoman machine shows how bureaucracy can turn cruelty into routine, how records and ledgers can disguise exploitation as administration. Whenever efficiency eclipses empathy, whenever humans are counted, but not seen, the risk of repeating such systems returns. Whether in politics, economics, or social life, the true test of civilization is not its monuments or armies, but how it treats its most vulnerable. The fall of the empire in 1922 did not erase its legacy. Its stories live on as cautionary echoes. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson: history is not gone. It waits for us, whispering through songs, documents, and bones in the earth. If we listen closely, it can teach us not only what was, but what must never be again. Thank you, subscribe now and don't miss what's to come.